So we are talking about empowering people to deal with climate change, in particular about the anxiety people feel, especially the youth, about all the messages they are hearing about climate change. Lots of things qualify as alarmist messages. Something happens like a big landslide, let's say. Instead of saying why it happened, whether we forecasted it correctly, whether we had given enough local information to avoid such disasters, most climate scientists, many, let's say, not most, many climate scientists jump ahead and say, we told you this is what happens with climate change and it will only get worse. So people feel anxious because they feel helpless. They think maybe there is nothing they can do. And that's not true. So what factors actually influence how people assess the risk of climate change? Okay, so here is 1.5 degrees C, which is one of the warming targets that we have talked about repeatedly in other contexts. It's basically something that Paris Agreement said we should try to stay below 2 degrees centigrade because that's some sort of a dangerous threshold, even though that target comes from Bill Nordhaus and economists who made it up, saying we haven't seen 2 degrees C warming in the last 100,000 or longer, and that could be very bad for economies and GDPs. And then the European countries took it up as a very important number, and then IPCC and the climate scientists bent over backwards to say what will happen if we cross 2 degrees C. But the information is not as local as you would want in terms of actions, mitigation or adaptation. And 1.5 degrees C came from the alliance of islands developing, small island developing states, whatever it is, AIDS. And okay, so these are not really scientific in that sense. Keeping all that in mind, despite widespread acknowledgement that climate change is a profoundly serious global problem and that urgent changes are needed in human behavior at all levels of society to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, this awareness has not yet led to actions around the world that are commensurate with the threat. We know, yet at the same time we seem to not know enough to act. We know, yet at the same time we seem to not know enough to act. Well, first of all, here when we say urgent changes in human behavior needed at all levels, well, what will happen if everybody changed their behavior and started consuming as little as possible, stopped eating meat, stopped flying around? Okay, is it possible for us to do all that? Well, the system is a carbon system. Everything we do is carbon. Energy and everything we produce is carbon. So unless we decarbonize the system, there is very little behavioral change can do. So we have to be aware of that as well. Keeping all that in mind, we must be aware of our intrinsic cognitive biases that we need to overcome to properly address climate change. So even when I'm saying something and then raising an objection, that shows my cognitive bias as well. So this is intrinsic evolutionary aspect of all species, but especially us. Higher cognitive ability, communication, and so on. So how humans make sense of facts does not simply follow from rational interpretations of scientific evidence. For example, humans are prone to exaggerate some risks, for example those that are spectacular, beyond personal control, much discussed, highly visible, or that affect them personally and are imposed by a clear enemy. People tend to downplay other risks, for example those that are common, familiar, invisible, long-term, gradual, natural, affect others, not self, and lack any clear bad guy. Something is happening but you don't know who's causing it, then you say, well, that's what it is. Unfortunately, climate change is often described in these terms. It's caused by commonplace, natural, invisible gases, although excessive amounts of these are emitted by human behavior, which is the major problem. So CO2 is a trace gas. It's in a very tiny amount, 0.04% of the concentration in the atmosphere. So very small. It is seen as slow moving, although many would actually argue that it is taking place at a breakneck speed, and it is often described in abstract scientific terms, which makes it harder for people to engage with. Climate change can often seem distant in space, especially when we keep saying 2100 will see much worse heat waves, many more extreme events, sea level rise will be this or that, and so on. So 2100 is very far for most people, even for decision makers. Maybe some militaries will worry about 2100 when they build a new port or something. Most people tend to see the worst environmental problems as being global or far away from them. However, people's feelings of responsibility for the environment are greatest at the neighborhood level. If you see pollution in your neighborhood, if you see trees dying or floods and droughts increasing, wildfires, heat waves, then people say, yes, something is happening in my neighborhood, in my backyard. People can also see climate change as distant in time. Again, if you say 2100, they don't know what we are talking about. Is it something they have to worry about for tomorrow, for their kids' lifetime in the next couple of decades? Or is it 2100 they have to worry about? The worst impacts are far off in time, so it still feels distant from everyday concerns. People are thus less likely to take action to protect themselves. Just think about it. You take insurance for your car, for your house, for your health. You save money for your kids, but if something is very distant, like the environment that your kids and grandkids may grow up in, then you don't necessarily worry about it or pay for it, right? Climate change can also feel socially distant and not a problem that individuals can solve. So it feels too big to solve by us. As a global problem that requires global solutions, it's easy to think that world leaders, governments, and big multinational corporations have the most responsibility for doing something about it, not us. Well, partly true, but what can we do? The way people see the risks associated with climate change are significantly influenced by their values, beliefs, worldviews, and cultural identity. We automatically look for information that confirms that we already think, want, or feel, and filter away opposing information. It's a rational ignorance, so you know something. You know it could be bad, like let's say smoking or drinking or eating red meat or whatever, okay? But you keep ignoring it because you think, well, it's not happening right now anyways. People are already concerned about climate change, for example. People who are already concerned about climate change, for example, will read more news that confirms it. People who don't believe in it or who are heavily invested in a world governed by fossil fuels might prefer news that questions climate science. So confirmation bias, and unfortunately even the search engines work in a way that they will keep on feeding what you are looking for, more and more and more of what you are looking for. This can lead us to avoid or forget vital facts about climate change that would require us to change our own beliefs and behavior. Okay, so let's look at activate again. We started with acknowledge feelings. Acknowledge feelings about climate change to yourself and others. Manage your feelings, manage your feelings. There is a lot of text. I'm going to skip and just read the most salient points again, very subjectively chosen by me, but you should definitely go back and read the nice report if you're interested. Coping with feelings we have about climate change ensures that we don't try to avoid the problem in order to avoid the feelings. We don't become overwhelmed by these feelings or burn out. We can keep functioning well in our everyday lives. This is said in another way. We keep hearing climate scientists saying there is a climate crisis, but they are living a fairly normal life, worrying about their salaries, their promotion, their awards, their publications, and their retirement savings, their kids' school and their house, and so on and so forth. So messaging is very important, because it probably means climate scientists themselves are not so overwhelmed that they are crippled by it or changing their lives drastically. They're just saying there is a crisis, we must do something. So there is this idea of managing, coping, and not getting burned out. Okay, Acknowledge feelings about climate change to yourself and others. Anticipate that you are likely to have strong feelings when you are thinking about or learning about climate change threats and impacts. That helps you recognize the feelings when they do arise and be ready to manage them rather than just avoiding the topic or minimizing or denying its seriousness so as to avoid the uncomfortable feelings. Or you are in the company of people who deny climate change and you don't want to argue about it and spoil friendships and so on. Identify the actual feelings you have, name them, acknowledge them, talk about them with others. These kind of words you also see in trainings for mindfulness, about dealing with anxiety that is not related to climate change, and so on and so forth. So it is still the same psychological approach for any anxiety, even if it's created by climate change. Also acknowledge your own tendencies to ignore, deny, or avoid thinking about environmental problems. Talking about this will help others to identify and acknowledge similar reactions in themselves. Give others the space to be able to express their feelings about climate change too. So if you are in a company of people who are questioning honestly or not, you have to still deal with it. This helps them to face the reality of climate change and be able to take the next step of engaging in solutions. This is also an important way of engaging in deep conversations that is discussed in section T. Talk about it of the activate. So there are some people who are practicing rational ignorance, so they don't want to accept climate change even though they know it's happening, even though they know that humans are responsible. So you do want to debate them, but there is a limit to what you can actually do, right? Use expressive coping, seek social support, maintain healthy routines, restore yourself psychologically. Use different ways of thinking about the problems to change how you feel. For example, instead of being overwhelmed and paralyzed by guilt for all the ways that your environmental footprint has already contributed to climate change, you could reframe how you think about it. We are all in this together. Most of us have been beneficiaries of our material society and so on. Allow yourself to be in touch with the feelings of loss, whether it's personal loss or whether it's a park in your neighborhood or your favorite location, glaciers melting, for example, and so on. You must accept that this is not your individual problem, or it's not that you alone caused it, that we are all in this together. Okay, so problem faced coping strategies aim at trying to do something about the problem which is causing distress. Okay, so maybe we'll come back and read this in the next podcast, because this is already 13 minutes long. Okay, so just kind of listen to the points. If you are feeling anxious, these will help you. If you're somebody who is not worried at all, then you need to also maybe think about the risk and say, is it a risk that is imminent for you or for your kids or for your grandchildren, and what actually can be done, not just by you but by you talking to the decision makers, worrying about the things you buy in terms of efficiency and so on, or not buying things that you don't really need. Most often you have many no regret decisions like don't waste water, energy, food, and so on, right? Those also help deal with climate change mitigation. So just keep it in mind. Okay.